So welcome everyone to today's session with Dr. Robert Hoyland. I'm Dr. Uzma, and I'm in the Department of Sociology at the University of Management and Technology, and I've been tasked with moderating today's session. I hope we have a really insightful discussion, and also I hope that the participants, the audience, come up with a lot of good questions for Dr. Hoyland here. The session is titled Islam as Others See It, Have Seen It. And it's based on Dr. Hoyland's book. Now, Dr. Robert is currently a professor of late antique and early Islamic Middle Eastern history at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. He read Oriental Studies at Oxford University, where he subsequently wrote a doctoral thesis on non-Muslim accounts of the rise of Islam. Seeing Islam as others saw it was part of his doctoral dissertation. And this talk is primarily based on that, but we're hoping we'll have larger conversations about the writing of the history of Islam as well. So if, Dr. Robert, you could talk about the book, what motivated you to write it, what was it based on, because we have discussed there was an earlier book written by Patricia and Michael Cooke, which was also a non-Muslim's account of early Islam. And Dr. Robert's book is sort of based on that. So what was your book about and how was it different from it?
Yeah, thank you. I start with a historiographical problem in my book. Really, it's how do we write about the rise of Islam? You might think that's very easy. We have lots of histories written in Arabic. For a historian, there's a problem there. The first tangible Arabic historical book that we have that we could pick up and hold is only from 840 AD. So it's 210 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. A lot of things happened in that time, the Arab conquests, a new empire established, first in Damascus, they moved to Baghdad. So how do we know that what we're being told 210 years later is a real verifiable account of what actually was happening in the early years? Usually when there's a lot of dramatic changes, history gets rewritten to suit the new situation. My supervisor, Patricia, who's at the Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, wrote a rather sensational book with Michael Cooke, then a professor in London, called Hagerism, the Making of the Islamic World. And they took a number of contemporary Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian accounts, written in the 7th century, some of them written at the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the Arab conquests. And they came up with a very different narrative, a very different explanation and account of the rise of Islam to what we find in the Islamic sources. If that was done today, it would actually cause a big stir, because it was done in the 1970s when no one was particularly worried about that. And also, I suppose for the Muslim world, they weren't feeling a bit, on the back foot, pressurized by the West to conform to a certain type of, behavior. So no one was worried about it. There weren't actually any demonstrations about it at all, even though they said that Muhammad was a Jew, for example. No problem at all in the 70s. So my first question in the book was, can we actually trust these non-Muslim sources anymore? We say yes, or they say in the book that you can't trust the Muslim sources, but how do we know they are, just because they're earlier, that we could trust these Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian sources? They are giving a different perspective, but equally they're outsiders. They weren't insiders the Muslim community, they weren't part of the Prophet Muhammad's group and so on. So my first aim was to evaluate these sources for their reliability, their perspective, and the genuineness of the information they're telling us. There is certainly a value to them for the fact that they are contemporary, so they could give us insights that the later Muslim sources couldn't give. In particular, because the Muslim sources from the 9th century were mainly interested just to reconstruct the history of their own community, the Muslim community. And so the world around them wasn't of interest to them. So the conquered people they have no interest in them. So on the positive side, the Christian sources can tell us about the Christians in the 7th century, the Jewish sources about the Jews in the 7th century, and so on. So there are value for painting a broader context, the world of the 7th century that Islam arose in. The other aspect that's kind of useful from these sources is it tells us about how the Muslim conquerors established a kind of modus vivendi, a way to live in symbiosis with the conquered people, with the Jews, the Christians, and the Zoroastrians. In the beginning, while they're conquerors, they're not that interested. But gradually, they stop being military conquerors and they become civilians. They become shopkeepers, scholars, administrators, and so on. And then they need to be able to live with the conquered subjects, with the non-Muslim peoples. This is interesting because actually the system they evolved is still used today in many Muslim countries, particularly those that have a more stricter application of Islam, like Saudi Arabia, for example. There's a question that is often used as an exam question for undergraduates studying Islamic history, which is Islam more tolerant than Christianity? It's a very modern take because tolerance is something we've come to value, but it wouldn't really have been perceived as a value in the pre-modern period. But the answer that the student is meant to come up with, though obviously if they come up with a different one, fine, but they're meant to say that in the pre-modern period, the good thing about what Islam did was it came up with a legal situation for non-Muslims. This is how Christians, Jews, and that are to be treated. They're 100% to be protected according to their life and possessions and so on. But they have certain things that certain ways they must behave. They're not allowed to preach their own religion, for example, to Muslims. If they pass by a Muslim in the street and they're on a horse, they should get down from the horse. So there's a whole set of rules and regulations, but they're 100% protected. In the medieval Christian case, there is no protection. Christianity didn't evolve a legal kind of system for dealing with non-Christians. So in that sense, it's worse because you could persecute Jews, for example, because the law didn't say you shouldn't. As a human, you might not want to, but that, in the medieval context, non-Christians had no legal protection under the law, whereas they did in Islam. In the modern context, of course, that's more messy because the legal system for non-Muslims in Islam means that non-Muslims don't have the same status as Muslims. And there are certain aspects where they're inferior because they must accept that they have to show greater respect to Muslims. As I say, they should dress in certain ways. They should, if a Muslim's trying to pass by, they must stand aside. So all these sort of restrictions which make things more difficult in the modern case, where in theory everyone ought to be equal. So this is something, for example, Saudi Arabia at the moment is actually wrestling with how to create an equal state with equal rights for all your citizens when Islamic law doesn't think in those terms, or not the medieval Islamic law. So those were the key things that I was trying to do.
And you mentioned that Patricia and Michael did not really have to face a lot of controversy, but when I was researching about this book, I found some accounts of how, maybe their accounts were not as authentic or as reliable. And you mentioned reliability as well as an aspect of history writing. So in your research, through your book, were you able to verify their claims, the claims that they were making in their book, and to what extent? And were you able to achieve that level of reliability needed in history writing in those accounts? And did you find that they had achieved it?
So that's quite a difficult question. So as I say, I tried to assess what we could use the non-Muslim sources for and what we couldn't. So in trying to understand the motivations of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, that's probably where the non-Muslim sources are at their least useful. But for seeing their actions and obviously seeing the treatment of non-Muslims, then that's where the non-Muslim sources are at their most useful. There's a few, it's interesting, as I said, that when they wrote, it wasn't a controversial sort of question. Inevitably, since 9/11, Danish cartoons about Muhammad, every sort of new incident that occurs, a Quran burning in Afghanistan and so on, then this sort of history becomes a lot more controversial. And if any of you are avid kind of bloggers or readers on the internet, there you will find a huge kind of debate. If you type in Patricia name or Hagerism, you get a lot of debates on either side. It's actually very useful for teaching because you have, for example, there's a website called IslamicAwareness.org which puts the kind of Muslim point of view, and there's another one called Answeringislam.org which then goes from the other side. A lot of the observations that are made by non-Muslim sources are a bit difficult to know what to deal with. So, for example, they say that Muhammad is alive during the conquest of Jerusalem. So he's alive. In the Muslim accounts, he dies in Arabia. And that's it. Before the conquest had properly started, that happens with his successor, Abu Bakr. But in a number of Christian sources, they have him go to Palestine. And the aim, it seems, is that he wants to capture Jerusalem. Jerusalem is key to his program in the Christian account, but that's not really there in the Muslim account. What do we do with that? So because they just simply exclude the Muslim accounts, then, as I say, they write a new narrative, and in their narrative, then the Prophet Muhammad is formed a pact with the Jews where they're going to capture Jerusalem together in preparation for the end of time when the temple, Jewish temple, will be rebuilt and so on. The problem as a historian, though, is how do I know that this isn't just the Christians thinking that this is what Muhammad was intending? To them, you have to understand, in our terms, there's a new world order emerging, and this is scary. So there's a lot of apocalyptic ideas circulating. Is this the end of the world? Is something really bad and major happening? And they see these Arabian warriors kind of running around capturing places. So there's a lot of apocalyptic expectation. And for Jews and Christians, a lot of that does center on Jerusalem. For the Jews, the temple is meant to be rebuilt and the Messiah is meant to come down in Jerusalem. So the Jews certainly have a lot of these apocalyptic ideas and do see Muhammad. In some Jewish texts, in biblical or extra-biblical texts, the person who precedes the Messiah is actually a non-Jew. So for them, that can fit perfectly that the Prophet Muhammad could be a prophet for the Jews. So these questions are actually still played out on the internet with quite interesting and fierce discussions on either side. So because it's a question of perception, there's no easy way to reconcile it. The Muslim sources and the non-Muslim sources just have a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Has there been an effort to reconcile these varying narratives? Because it seems that this is a recurrent theme in the writing of history, the history of Islam. There's the non-Muslim account of it, and then there's the Muslim account, and there are all these discrepancies based on who's looking. If the insider is looking, it's like fish in the water. I'm so used to what is around me. I look at it from a certain perspective. I might not see what you will as an outsider observe. So, how do you reconcile those differences if you do at all, or you just...
And there's a problem now there's a positive side to all the attention on our subject in that we get much more interest. Students are very interested. Generally, I get a lot of people write to me from around the world asking questions about, what really happened in the rise of Islam, and it is very exciting. But it's much more of a politicized subject. On the one side, you get some academics who have a fairly anti-Islam sort of bias. So you will find lots of videos online about how Muhammad never existed, how Mecca actually was in Palestine anyway, it's not actually in Mecca. And there's an idea if we can show that Muslim sources are wrong, then we can also, to some extent, disprove. Okay, yeah. There's an idea that from those who have a more anti-Muslim bias, that if we can show that the Muslim sources are wrong, we also score against Muslims, if you like. And you get the other side, though. You get especially many academics are a bit left-leaning, and so they want to be more apologetic. So they shy away from saying anything that could be seen as negative. So, for example, as I was telling a colleague earlier, there's a number of books about Jesus. There's a very famous one, Jesus the Jew, for example, but Jesus the Zealot, which is written by actually a Muslim guy, Reza Aslan. But for Muhammad, none of this is ever written. And everyone will be a bit scared to do it. I mean, you can imagine writing a book like Muhammad the Jew or something like that. Something terrible could happen. But it's sad that means you can't really, though, just have a simply open discussion about some of these issues for the rise of Islam. As a historian, to me, it's, I'm just interested in writing something about the past that's interesting and potentially holds to facts and that can mean interesting discussion of these issues. But they are sensitive, and it means it's very difficult to write about these days and to discuss.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you're mentioning it's a sensitive issue to write about, and you mentioned Patricia and Michael did not have to face as much controversy in the 70s because that wasn't a time where there was this heightened sensitivity regarding religious matters. Did you have to face it?
So not initially. When I asked Patricia Kroner about if it was okay to do a PhD on this subject, she said, "Oh, don't do early Islam. No one's got any interest in it. You'll never get a job." So this
that worked in your favor.
So this is the middle of 1990s. So yeah, it's not interesting to anyone. But as soon as 9/11 happened, it is amazing how much it changed things. Baroness Wasi was pointing this out in her talk as well. So after that, yes, I mean, the last book I wrote, which was on the Arab conquests, I had many positive comments, but some quite hostile ones, which I was surprised at because it's just a very ordinary book, mainly written for undergraduates, and that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago.
How do you, in the writing of this history of Islam, see Islam? Is it Islam, the theology, and do you distinguish it from Islam, the civilization? And how do you explain that? How is that part of the narrative in your book?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because one of the problems, of course, of dealing with Islam is it became the word for both a religion and a civilization. And ideally, you want to separate them out, because although the religion is obviously a key part of Islamic civilization, it's only one part. There's art, there's philosophy, there's science. And so the huge focus on religion again makes it a much more complicated affair to write about the emergence of Islamic civilization. Because if you're thinking theologically, for any religion, people want to focus on certain key things, like a moment of revelation. So if you're talking theologically, then we can feel that Islamic civilization began at the moment that Muhammad received the revelation, and that everything before that was darkness, jahiliyyah, as you would say it in Arabic. There's lots of famous hadiths about normally companions of the Prophet saying about, in the good old days in the jahiliyyah, we worshipped idols, we beat our women, we did all these terrible things and ate lots of camels and whatever, went drinking every night. But now we're good Muslims, and so now we're not going to do any of this. But this is obviously a very theological, religiously driven way of looking at it. And in reality, civilizations take a long time to develop. There's a long process there. And they draw hugely on what has gone before. But theologically, there's an idea that Islam eradicated what went before it. It owes nothing to foreign civilizations. It has its own internal dynamic. And some Muslim thinkers will dislike the idea that you say, but this element of Islamic civilization is actually drawn from Zoroastrianism, is drawn from Buddhism or whatever. So again, this is a very complicating factor about writing about the emergence of Islamic civilization. Always the religious dimension can disrupt that discussion.
Do you draw some conclusions from it, from the writing of early Islamic history and relate it to the modern times and what's happening right now? Do you see some similarities?
This is something that people want you to do. I kind of resisted a bit. The last book I wrote is called In God's Path, the Arab Conquests and the First Islamic Empire. And it happened to come out as ISIS was just making inroads into Iraq. And so inevitably, I got lots of questions about what are the insights for today. I mean, what was interesting for me, of course, is the thinking about why the Arab conquests in the 7th century were so successful in demolishing this 1100-year-old Persian empire, was that the Persian Empire had suffered a civil war. They were very much focused on their own internal problems, and so the Arabs were able to march in relatively easily. And so seeing how ISIS, with Iraq obviously very focused internally on its own problems, Shia, Sunni issues and so on, seeing how ISIS was also able to march down very quickly towards Baghdad, it was quite insightful. But mostly I dislike having to speak too much on the relevance for today. Obviously, it's in people's minds, so people's memories. So I spend a lot of time in the Middle East, and for them, I always find it quite impressive how much people know about 7th century history, or the version they read. Anyway, they're very well versed on it, and much, much better than anyone in Europe knows about their pre-modern history. So it influences their thinking anyway.
Yeah, it did. This idea of memories did come up in some session yesterday as well, in your session actually. And how much, do memories influence our actions in the present as well? How much do we replicate through those memories? That was mainly what I was actually asking as well. What was your personal motivation in indulging in this topic, apart from the fact that you are obviously a historian of the Middle East? What motivated you? What drove you to work on verifying the claims of Patricia Crone and Michael Cooke? What was it?
Well, partly Patricia Crone, who died recently, sadly. She was an amazingly thought-provoking, enthusiastic, exciting teacher. So it's partly driven by her. And the book Hagerism, hate it or love it, it is an amazing book and very stimulating. But also this period of history, it is amazing. The 7th century, it is one of those few moments in history when the whole world changes. For, as I said, for 1100 years, you've had the Roman Empire, Greek Roman Empire in the West facing off against the Persian Empire, whether it's the Achaemenid dynasty, Seleucids or Sassanids. But from 500 BC to 600 AD, you've had these empires. And so it's been a bipolar world. But with the Arab conquests, the one empire is demolished and the other is hugely reduced in size. So it suddenly becomes a unipolar world. It's a bit like if you're thinking of the Cold War, the difference that made, the collapse of Russia. Except in this case, it was an enduring situation. The Muslim empire dominated from Morocco to Afghanistan for a very long period of time. It had its own internal fragmentation, but in terms of a civilization, it's obviously endured till today. And the beginnings of that are in the 7th century, so it's exciting. Beginnings are always interesting, but this is particularly a world-changing moment.
I also have to ask about, this is my pet peeve, the exclusion of gendered voices from history. As a historian, as a male historian, do you see, and how do you see the impact of the exclusion of these voices? Because it does matter, especially when it comes to religion, that women's voices have been systematically excluded over time. And because of that, we don't really hear their side of the story, or something, as we talk about Muslim and non-Muslim accounts of history, of reality as it's happening and that being recorded, we can see that a male perspective of what's happening would be different from a woman's perspective. And so what is recorded, and not just a woman's or a man's, any marginalized community as well, other aspects of one's identity, ethnicity, race, class, etc., they all might influence the way you see reality. So as a historian, did you see that as part of the narrative that was there about early Islamic history, and how do you see it as being a general influence in the writing of the history of religion, Islam in particular, and other religions as well?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, really. I mean, I wrote a book on pre-Islamic Arabia and managed to do a chapter on women, because you could find women actually in pre-Islamic Arabia tended to tell the stories. So they were storytellers. They actually were entertainers to some extent. You'll find them playing certain instruments and certain types of songs were exclusively given by women. But it's limited. It's particularly the narratives. Yes, you don't have histories written by women. And so you can focus to some extent. So, for example, at the time of Muhammad, there are actually a number of other prophets, and one of them is a woman, Sajjah. So you can at least tell a little bit of the narratives there. But it's just minor because, I mean, we haven't got her account of what she thought she was doing. So I can highlight this. Hopefully, maybe my students will run with it and find it interesting. But
I was just curious if there has been a discussion about the impact of the absence of these voices in the histories of different religions, Abrahamic religions in particular, and what impact. And even right now, currently in our time, what is being done to sort of address the idea of speaking truth to power. How do you record history in these times? What are the challenges? How, as a marginalized community, and not even a marginalized community right now, just as anyone, how do you record history as it is? The idea of authenticity and reliability, and how do you validate the truth?
Mm. Yeah, you, as a historian, you have to kind of work hard to try and track down any of the, partly it's keeping it in your mind at least, because if you don't keep it in your mind, then you will only write male history, and not only just male history, but male history from the dominant community. So the first thing is at least to keep it in your mind so that you can try and look, to try and seek out some other sources. Think to yourself, but also besides women, who were the disempowered, who were the minority groups? Is there any way I can at least find sources by them and bring them in? But it is difficult. So for those who are interested in women's history, there tends to be a couple of things that people focus on. So you've got the wives of the Prophet Muhammad. There are a certain number of female transmitters of Muhammad's sayings. The richest sort of area is Sufism, which at a very nice talk yesterday on Sufi shrines, as the first speaker mentioned, it's one of the key things of Sufism is tolerance. You will find, if you go to a Sufi shrine, plenty of women there as well. And mysticism is interesting. The idea of contact with the divine is genderless. A woman can as easily get in contact with God, reach out to God as a man can. So that's probably the richest area for finding women's input.
Yeah, because just not just the talking about women, but also gendered perspectives on any issue. So, for example, hijab or just relationships or anything, any idea, because we say Islam is a way of life. So, any aspect of that way of life from a woman's perspective is largely excluded from history books. What other challenges do you see in our times now for history writing, for recording religious history?
As I said, the biggest one is just simply trying to get over the politicized situation in regard to early Islamic history. It's interesting because you'll see there's a guy in America, Daniel Pipes, who just wrote a very ordinary PhD on a slave revolt in 9th century Iraq, but then he became the leader of this pushing campus watching. There's a jihad watch, I think he set up, trying to watch, people showing any pro-Muslim tendencies and so on in the American campuses. And then, say, you see the opposite, where people try to write. There's one guy who has this idea about how the Arab conquests weren't violent. Actually, they practiced anti-violence. I mean, how do you conquer people without violence? You can't just love them into giving you their homes and their cities. So you get the opposite. So I always try to push a kind of non-politicized approach to history and try and get people to see that both versions are harmful.
Or objectively politicized.
Yeah. I find it less problematic for my Muslim students, who normally actually are the most happy to discuss anything, and it's the non-Muslim students who either tend to be rather anti or very pro and wanting to be very, not wanting to say anything that might be seen as slightly negative, whereas the Muslim students are much more happy to discuss it outright.
I was going to ask, do you see any parallels between the history of early Islam and the history of other religions or other civilizations? You know?
The interesting thing about Islam, of course, it's a bit nearer to us in time. So for Hinduism and Buddhism, they're remoter in time, and the sources aren't really there. For Christianity, it's easier because Jesus, even if he's born in a rather kind of rural setting, he's born in the heart of the Roman Empire with fantastic sources. So for the context, it's amazing. We can write so much about the rise of Christianity that we can't for the rise of Islam. So because the Prophet Muhammad is acting outside the empires in a relatively remote area of Arabia, it's much more difficult to write about. And it's rather unusual, and it's partly because this is a rather unusual situation. I mean, some more radical scholars will say, well, it can't have happened in Arabia. It must have actually happened. Muhammad must have been somewhere in Iraq or Syria, where it's much more civilized and there were more religious traditions to draw on. So it's actually an unusual, rather unique history to write about.
Should we open the floor for questions here? I think there are a lot of questions. Do we have a mic? Yeah, we have 15 minutes, and I think we can spend that on some questions from the audience. Okay, we have a question, yeah. Please say your name and affiliation, institutional affiliation, and just ask the question.
Okay. My name is Syed Ahad Ali. I'm with the University of Management and Technology. Dr. Robert, first and foremost, thank you for being here. It's an honor to meet you. So I'd like to start off with the book itself. I have gone through it, I have read it, and there were a few instances where I started to pick up a hint of prejudice towards like the narrative, like you were building, well, the narrations in that were building kind of anti or antagonizing point towards Islam, being that it was the third monotheist religion, okay, coming out, Judaism, then Christianity, then Islam. So the perspectives, especially from the Jews or the Christians, could that have been because Islam was emerging and they really didn't want it to be? They had the Byzantine Empire, they had the Roman Empire, the Greeks, the Armenians. Did they just not really see eye to eye with Islam? Or was it just that possibly, the book mentions Muhammad the trader pillaged and looted this village, and he went here and we went here. And I think in page 141, the book mentions about the arbitration in Medina between the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. And under it, the sources and all that were given, they say that Muhammad never mentioned himself as, he mentioned that he was a prophet of God. And this is where the Quran does say that, O Muhammad, we have sent you as a mercy to whole mankind. So, I mean, those elements and all, were kind of missing. So could you please comment on that?
Yeah, on the first one, the Christians and the Zoroastrians are fairly obviously unhappy because they were top dogs and suddenly they've been reduced. So the Zoroastrians lost their whole empire, so they're particularly bitter about it. For the Christians, it's interesting that it depends, if they were part of the Roman Empire, they tend to be fairly negative. But for the Christians that lived under Persian rule in Iraq, they already weren't part of the governing apparatus, and so they can be a bit more neutral about it. And they will tend to accept that Muhammad was a prophet, and that he was sent by God, but to bring monotheism to the pagan Arabs, so that at least he elevated them up from the level of pagans to monotheists. I mean, they tend to say, well, they weren't clever enough, the Arabs, to learn about the intricacies of the Trinity, so Muhammad didn't bother with that bit, which is an interesting way of looking at it. But so you get different perspectives. But you're right, the majority of Christians and Zoroastrians were particularly unhappy. I mean, it's interesting. Actually, if you go to Iran today, I mean, Iranians, some of them will still be, oh, you know, we were great once, and then Islam came. So some Persians have a rather ambiguous view historically. Anyway, they remember the great days of Cyrus the Great and Khusrau and so on. So you're right. There's certainly prejudice. The question, as a historian, though, is if you're prejudiced, does that necessarily mean you can't report any objective fact? So there's an account, for example, of a French pilgrim who goes to Jerusalem in the year 670, and he says that the Saracens, the Muslims, have built a prayer place on the Temple Mount. He says that it's a bit rough. And so you could say, okay, that might be his prejudice. But it'd be hard to think that even if he's prejudiced, he would simply make up the fact that the Arabs had built this structure. So prejudice is, you have to think, what are they reporting? If they're reporting some very concrete thing, you could presumably trust it. If they're only giving their abstract opinion about something, then you might feel that the prejudice has totally coloured this and that you couldn't accept it. As for page 141, I did write this 20 years ago, so I'm not sure I remember what's on page 141. But we can talk about that. I'm happy to talk about it in particular.
Yes.
Where's the next question?
Yes. Thank you so much. My name is Tariq Aziz. Basically, I'm from Khyber Agency, FATA, Peshawar. And here I'm studying at University of Management Technology. Yes, sir, you are looking at me?
I just trying to see you, right?
Here I'm studying in University of Management Technology, MPhil Sociology. Sir, my question is, you talk about Sunni-Shia genocides. So I'm also basically from that area. So this is one of the common problem here. So how did you collect data about this Sunni and Shia genocides, and what was your experience about this? This is my question. And my next question is, how did you conduct your research? And the third question is, how would you conduct the idea of your book? So this is my question. Thank you.
What was the third one?
How did you go about the idea of your book?
Yes.
How did you deal with that?
The first one, the Sunni-Shia split, is actually perhaps one of the most interesting ones for illustrating my point about process versus event. Because now, I mean, whenever you listen to any explanation of Sunni-Shia violence in the West or wherever, they'll always say, yes, and this happened this moment in 656, 57, when Ali versus Muawiyah. In reality, it's quite a slow process of the evolution of Shia as a sect. There are no Sunni and Shia in the 7th or even the 8th century, really. It's a process of, Ali was actually favored by a fairly substantial number of Muslims of the time. Gradually, the difference increases, and it's really when there's a series of descendants of Ali imams, and when the 11th imam, something happens, either he doesn't have a child or his child dies young. And at this moment, I mean, this is way up in 860s, some of them decide, okay, well, it was wrong anyway, and so they head in a different direction. Some say, well, we'll put the imam into hiding. Some say, okay, we'll produce a new imam. So the Ismailis come up with a whole new imam. And so this kind of polarizes things, and people had to make a choice. But some decided that, okay, they're going to stay with the mainstream. And in many ways, Sunnism is really about the mainstream. Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Jama'ah is consensus. It's about what the majority believe. And so it's really takes a long time. There's a whole series of steps. There's a series of revolts in favor of Ali's descendants. And so it's a long time before we get the emergence of a distinctive Shia identity. People who said, I'm Shia, or I'm Sunni. At the beginning, no, everyone was, I'm Muslim. And that's for the 7th century and for the 8th century, Muslim. your second question. Well, how did I go about it? It's interesting, as I tell my students now, that in those days you went to a library and you got a big stack of books and you sat there from morning till night and wrote your notes. And it seems to me very ancient. Now I'm like my students. I don't like going to libraries. I want to find everything on the internet. And I'm also a passionate believer in going to see what you write about. So I've always traveled to all the places that I've ever written about. I'm very excited to be here in Pakistan because I have written a little bit about events in the capture of Sindh by the Muslims and the establishment of Multan. So I'm pleased that I can say now I've been here. The idea of the book, well, as I said in the beginning, it was partly inspiration of my supervisor, partly just fascination, as I still have, with this moment in history when you see a huge change in a world order that had persisted. It's the end of this antique, tends to be called the end of antiquity, but it's then the beginnings of the birth of the modern world, if you like. So it's just a fascinating period to write about.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Abdullah Khan. I'm from Nas Business School, Islamabad. For me, the most fascinating part about your talk here was, is Islam more tolerant than Christianity? And you talked about the pre-modern period and how there was a legal system intact for non-Muslims and there was no protection in Christianity. So my question here is, what is the exact moment in history or time where the tables tend to turn and then the people start talking about the radical Islamic terrorism and no tolerance? What was the moment in history as a historian that you track where the tables started to turn?
Well, the first, I suppose, is when the whole idea of a state in which all citizens are equal. I suppose we go back to around the time of the French Revolution, really. This is quite novel. I mean, for a medieval baron, for example, in Europe, you hardly wanted to be treated equally as your serfs. And the same with regard to religion. I mean, you know, if we Christians are the saved sect, or we Muslims are the saved people and we're right and everyone else is wrong, why the hell should we treat infidels put on an equal basis as, you know, people who have the right belief? So it's a novel idea, if you like, that everyone should be treated equally, and it's the so really you're only looking at the 18th century for this idea to spread. For I don't see the connection with terrorism exactly. I suppose you mean maybe aggression towards minorities. I mean, for the Muslim world, this is still an issue, really, that's being worked through, given that religion has tended to play a bigger part. I mean, it did in medieval Christianity. It's not that we're all totally, you know, Europeans have been all rational for ages. It's really been a slow change for 200 years since the French Revolution till now, if you like, that we've tried to gradually work through. And obviously it's not perfect, but at least the idea is very strongly there of equality. But we've secularized to a fair degree, so during that period. So religion tends to play less of a part. I mean, in many ways, we're going a little bit into reverse over the last 20 years, of course, because Islam and other religions have come to the fore more. You see religion playing a big part in Trump's America as well. But for the Muslim world, it's still a difficult process of trying to accept and work out how do we... The idea is there, obviously, we treat everyone equally, but in practice, how does that work? And as I say, for states that want to emphasize religion strongly and make it their legal basis, what do we do? I mean, this is a tricky issue. I mean, Turkey managed it quite well, but other states like Saudi Arabia haven't. I mean, this is what the Sharia says in the 9th century, that we don't treat everyone equally. Non-Muslims should not have equal rights as Muslims. It's stated there in the 9th century text, and there was disagreement about it. So that it is a difficult issue. I mean, we have equivalents. I mean, for example, over homosexuality, it's difficult because religious texts seem not to be very pro-homosexuality, but we have to accept that it's equal. How can you for us, you can't discriminate. But they're difficult issues. So for those who are very strong believers, you know, if Jesus said this, then isn't it difficult for us to go against it? So to me, it's always going to be a long-term process, always fighting to accept that, you know, we must be treated equally. You know better than me for what goes on in Pakistan in that regard.
Okay, we have a very brief question here because you weren't supposed to just take the mic.
I have taken a question long, but I will try to short it. Okay. So my question, Assalamu alaikum, my name is Muhammad Abbas. And my question is about your, as a historian, interpretation of Islam as a religion. That you first stated and said that Islam was initially revolutionary at the very beginning. But then there comes the military interventions, military conquerors. Then there's civilization, as you said, that was come after an evolution, after a long period of time. Okay, if we say that Islam was for the as moral ethics and civilization, so it took a long time and it prevails now. But at the start there was military conquerors, and now at the present time, and you also said that Jerusalem as a key role behind of the military calculus and somewhat the philosophies there. But now also there are the military interventions in Middle East and Yemen, Iran, and Iran revolution is that. So what you think that if we if categorize that Islam is for civilization, so civilization has prevailed up till now, but now there are also military interventions as at the beginning were. So what do you think that actually philosophy of Islam where it leads? And also you have lived in Middle East as you said. So our great interpreter Lamak Muhammad Iqbal said that you
Just,
must
just
have
the question, just limit it to the
okay,
question.
it's
Yeah.
going out. Our interpreter Lama Muhammad Iqbal, they said that Muslims are not following their Islam, and you must have read the Quran, the source of Islam. So what you interpret that in actual what is Islam as it is shown by Daesh, Al Qaeda, and so on, as the dirty picture of wrong picture of Islam in West. So what you say that what is the in actual the philosophy of Islam? Where does this lead? In
Okay, we have the
actual?
question now. Thank you. Yeah.
Particularly with respect to violence, you mean? The philosophy of Islam, you mean? As it relates to violence and use of violence and so on. It's a long period of history, Islamic history, and like many religions, it has elements within it that, to some extent, contradictory, or they apply to different situations. Obviously, the Quran does talk about fighting. Muhammad was trying to establish the rule of God on earth. He wasn't going to do that solely by preaching. Partly he comes from a very different society. Jesus was from a poor peasant society within the Roman Empire. There's no way he had any hope of being able to overturn the Roman Empire. But the Prophet Muhammad came from a tribal society where self-defense was the norm, and he had a military reserve he could draw upon with the tribes. So inevitably, fighting was used. How do you square that? It's a very, I mean, this is a tricky one for Western politicians, because a lot of them like to repeat, Obama, Blair have all said, Islam is a religion of peace. Well, it can be, but it's also our decision. So for Christianity, I mean, in theory, Jesus said, turn the other cheek. But for heaven's sake, God, I can't think of a single Christian leader who didn't use fight and use armies and so on. So you also, well, our perspectives are going to be probably different. I come from a society where we separate out the religious bit from the politics. So for me, I have no problem that I practice a particular form of religion, and this isn't going to impact upon my public life, or how politicians might act, rather. It's my own personal belief and my own personal way of acting in this world. And I personally am a pacifist, but I accept that my government might not be, and I'm not going to impose my views on my government. It is more difficult as Muslims. I'd rather hear your opinions on this, really. I don't actually fully agree. There's an idea that Islam is, and politics and religion must be 100% united in Islam. I'm not sure that's totally true. There's certainly plenty of forms of Islam, like Sufism, that have not felt that they need to be involved in politics. But to be honest, this is something that you have to square with your own faith, how much you feel Islam has to be in public life. The Quran, as scriptures are often a bit, say different things, and so that's why we can spend 1,500 years interpreting the Quran and still not give a certain answer. But it has obviously bits talking about peace being very important, kindness towards other people, and so on. So one can focus on these bits and say, should be the philosophy of Islam. I don't know that you can ignore it. So for people, when they say Islam is totally a religion of peace, I don't know. Can you totally forget, obviously, that Muhammad did fight? He was a warrior as well. I don't know that just simply suppressing that helps. One sometimes have to accept parts of one's history that are different, but you say we're in a different place now. So we don't need to continue the fight.
We have a question over there, and please, a woman can ask a question as well. We haven't had a single question from a woman. That's making me very uncomfortable here. Please, so yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Zakula, and I'm a student of sociology, University of Management and Technology. Sir, I have a few questions. First of all...
Just one, please. We don't have time for a few questions.
Sir, first of all, what is your concept regarding God? Because as a Muslim... regarding God, we don't know what religion did you follow, because as a Muslim there are certain things regarding which we can't even question. We just blindly follow these things. And secondly, what did you find Prophet Muhammad's social life while writing a book on history? Because we studied that, or even we believe that Prophet Muhammad have a unique personality in every aspect of life, economically, socially, and even politically. So what did you find in this regard? Thank you.
The first one, are you asking my...
What is your concept regarding God? Because we didn't know what religion did you follow. And that's why we...
My Muslim students always like to ask this. I tell them I'm a mystic, really. I believe there are many paths to God. You have to find your own path. So I would be a Sufi. And the good thing about Sufis, as the person was telling us yesterday, you don't really have to worry too much about your particular faith. You don't even have to say, oh, you praying next to me, what are you, by the way? Are you really meant to be here anyway? You just accept. You're somebody on the path towards God in your own particular way. So that's my kind of take on it. It's kind of a little bit mixed in with being a hippie, perhaps. But again, about the Prophet's life, this is one of the most difficult areas of history writing, because religious founders start off as not very important people to the world at large. But over time, they become the biggest people in the whole world. They become millions of people, billions of people invest their hopes, their loves, their fears in these people. And so inevitably, the writing of their life, their biography, it grows. People who write those biographies, they put a lot of their own feelings into it. So to my mind, it's very difficult to establish the realities. And it would certainly be at least a whole other lecture anyway. So I'll leave it for now.
Did a woman come up with a question yet?
Ma'am, I have a question.
Of course. Male privilege right there. Okay, here. We'll get the mic here first, please. We can come back to you if we have time. I'm sorry. Well, yes, we can have 2-3 questions together as well, and then we can have the responses there. Would that work?
It might do. Depends how different their questions are.
True. Okay, yeah.
Hello, my name is Unza, and I don't have particular question, but I like to comment on something. I really like the idea of the book, because in my mind, I never knew that there were any discrepancies between the Islamic narrative and the Western narrative. So I really want to read this book to have an insight in how you've managed this particular subject. And because one of the things is because in Pakistan, and especially in school level, what they do is they provide a very self-sufficient account or narrative of the book. Like they don't like give any idea like how to validate particular point that they've given. So this is only on my part that I really like to read the book. And thank you.
You can pass on the mic, yes, to Dr. Tariq.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That's been absolutely fascinating. I just wanted to make a small, but I think a very significant point in relation to something you said in one of your answers about peace, about Islam being a religion of peace or not being a religion of peace, the Prophet Muhammad being involved in fighting and warfare and so on, and yourself that you were a pacifist. Well, peace means more than one thing. Pacifism isn't the only way, and in fact it isn't even the mainstream way of interpreting peace, neither for Christians nor Muslims. Peace can mean non-aggression. That is how most Christians understand peace. Most Christians are not pacifists, and that is quite consistent with Islam being a religion of peace.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mentioned my pacifism just because that's a personal point, but yes, you can interpret it in different ways. It won't feel peaceful if someone's sticking a sword through your heart. You probably won't agree that, you know, if the person says, honestly, I'm doing this for peace. So it itself is subjective. One can always argue that, gosh, if we just keep killing enough people, surely we'll eventually get peace. So, but, you know, so it's a moot point. But I take the point, yes.
There was a question right there.
I'm Shakil. I'm a media professional in Islamabad. So which Muslim society is relatively tolerant from Indonesia to Morocco? And how tolerant was Spain? And by the way, this point about Islam being religion of peace, not all Muslims actually say that Islam is a religion of peace. Anjum Chaudhry, who lives in the UK, he openly says Islam is not a religion of peace. Here, Khadim Rizvi says Islam is not a religion of peace. So is that consensus among Muslims also?
For sure.
We have one last question from the back. Do you want to respond to this?
No, I agree. Anyway, about most tolerance, as I say, it's a relative concept.
This will be the
tolerance,
last. This will be the last question.
Hi sir, Assalamu alaikum ma'am. I am Mohammad Faizan Jamil from Department of Sociology, University of Management and Technology. So I want to ask something about sectarianism. As a historian, kindly tell me there was some conceptual framework that led people towards sectarianism. As a historian, what's your say about that thing? A mental brief that lead people towards sectarianism, or some practical values that they are having and they just develop their phenomena or insulation on their minds that active them to behave some sectarian violence or activities. Thank you.
Yeah, another very big question. It's always a tricky one because often when sectarian violence breaks out, there are always people saying, but we used to live together so happily, there was no problem, whatever. Often it's because of a shift in economic circumstances, so that there is less to go round, and so you might feel that your people are more deserving of it than others. But, so did you, I'm trying to think whether you wanted me to ask a particular point about sectarianism or ways to stop it or whatever. Yeah, sorry, I'm not too sure where your question was going now. I think about it.
You can always have the conversation outside as well in detail if it's a bigger question.
Yeah. Yes, please do.
Yes, and we're short of time now. So thank you so much, Dr. Robert. That was a great discussion, insightful and exhaustive. Thank you. I hope this will lead a lot of the younger people, like you were saying, a lot of people when you were working on your dissertation were not really interested in early Islam, but probably it will compel a lot of students here today to go back and read about it and maybe also draw lessons from the history of early Islam for modern times. Thank you so much. Thank you.